Hello everyone and welcome to my latest movie review, which will be on Zodiac, that was released in 2007, directed by David Fincher. So just to give you guys a summary of the plot, so Zodiac is a thriller and it follows the story of Robert Graysmith, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, and he works for the San Francisco Chronicle, who along with his colleague Paul Avery, played by Robert Downey Jr, and Inspector Dave Toschi, played by Mark Ruffalo, collectively try to resolve the identity of the Zodiac Killer. So just to give you guys a heads up, this is a spoiler warning for Zodiac, so if you haven't seen the movie, set some time aside to see it, save this video, and then once you've seen the movie, come back to my review. So one of my favourite aspects of Zodiac is the story. So one of the most interesting aspects of the story is how it subverts audience expectations, and the best way the story does that is how it gives you the impression that every time our protagonist closes in on a piece of key evidence that we think is going to close the Zodiac case, David Fincher is great at putting various barriers in place and various conflicts that stop the investigators aligning key pieces of evidence with the suspects in question. A great example of this is when we see Dave Toschi, Bill Armstrong and Jack Mullinex interviewing Arthur Lee Allen at his place of work. It's funny because in key moments in the scene we think that the investigator is going to close in on a piece of evidence that will lead to Arthur Lee Allen being a key suspect in the case. At one point Dave Toschi asks Arthur for his wristwatch just to have a look at it as a potential key piece of evidence in the case. And then there's another example when we see Bill Armstrong asking Arthur that is he ambidextrous or not, and then Arthur debunks this myth that he can write with both hands when in fact he can't. It's these key moments in the scene where just when we think the investigators are closing in on a piece of evidence that will pretty much end the case once and for all, it's David Fincher saying to the audience, I'm building up this anticipation of closure in the investigation, and then telling the audience, well hang on a minute, no, that's not the direction that I want to go, and I want to frustrate the audience. And I think what David Fincher was going for was for us as an audience to feel the frustration of the investigators in the scene, and I think he perfectly captures that. I know for a fact that when I was watching Zodiac for the first time that I definitely felt that frustration, knowing that there's no way he can't be the suspect, he can't be the killer, based on all the evidence that's stacked against him in this particular scene. So another aspect of the movie that I love is the characters and acting involved. So up until the third act of the movie, where Robert Graysmith becomes a prominent figure in the story, up until then we see Bill Armstrong, Paul Avery and Dave Toschi being our sort of eyes and ears in the investigation. And that's the reason why I love Zodiac, is the decision that David Fincher took to make these, as he put it, these ancillary characters, prominent figures in the story in the first and second acts of the movie. It just means we get a really deep insight into their livelihoods. We see that these cops who investigate these sort of cases, it consumes their life, especially Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong. We see that they can't really lead normal lives outside of their work, and that their normal lives become their work, if that sort of makes sense. By David Fincher taking the time and effort to flesh out these ancillary characters in Zodiac, it just means we empathise and care that much more when they drop their duties in investigating the case. There's an example where Dave Toschi is accused of forging one of the Zodiac letters towards the second act of the movie, and because he spent so much time trying to take this guy down, we feel really sorry for him in this particular moment, because he spent so much time and effort and time away from his family to try and solve the identity of this particular murderer. And then when he's accused of it, it's funny because in that moment the police have no sympathy for him. They almost think, well, we want an answer just as much as you, and because you're being accused of being the Zodiac murder, well, we're just going to take that as gospel just because someone's put that in a letter. So those are the moments of defeat that it really hits home, because of the time and effort that the film takes in developing the motivations and giving them clear insights into their everyday lives in those first couple of acts of the movie. Because of the moments of defeat and frustration that we feel in the characters that we follow, the early portions of the story, it just means that we're rooting for Robert Graysmith's character that much more in the third act of the movie. So moving on to the acting element of my review, and one of my favourite performances in the movie is Jake Gyllenhaal in the role of Robert Graysmith. Despite the stubborn and persistent nature of his character, Jake Gyllenhaal always infuses Robert with a sense of likeability and charm. Because of this likeability and charm, we care that much more for Jake Gyllenhaal's character, and it just means when we get to the third act of the movie, when the various ancillary characters are no longer part of the story, we're just as determined as Robert's character to get to the bottom of the truth and try and find the identity of the Zodiac Killer once and for all. Moving on to my second favourite performance in the movie is Mark Ruffalo in the role of Dave Toschi. In watching the behind the scenes footage of the making of Zodiac, I was fascinated to find out that Mark Ruffalo actually met Dave Toschi in person. As a result of Mark Ruffalo's performance in terms of how he researched the role of Dave Toschi, it definitely comes across in Zodiac in terms of that level of authenticity and the sense, where he comes across as a very likeable and authentic cop, where you definitely believe this guy inhabits the role of a law enforcement officer, absolutely determined to get to the bottom of the truth. And when we see the moments of suffering in his character, as I mentioned before, where he's accused of forging one of the Zodiac letters, the moments of defeat that the character goes through, again, Mark Ruffalo portrays with such authenticity and honesty that we genuinely feel for his character. And as an audience member, when you genuinely feel for a character, in this case where multiple characters are trying to solve the Zodiac letters, in the case of Dave Toschi, we absolutely feel for him in this moment. And that's because of the fantastic performance that Mark Ruffalo brings to the role of Dave Toschi, where because he portrays the authentic and honest and likeable qualities in his character, it makes us that much more invested and that much more empathetic towards his character. My final favourite performance in the movie is Robert Downey Jr. in the role of Paul Avery. Despite the prominent role that Paul Avery has in the first couple of acts of the movie, in terms of trying to solve the various Zodiac murders, for the most part, in my opinion anyway, he's played for comic relief in the movie. Having said this though, I never really had a problem with the comic relief aspect of Paul Avery's character, and that's because I think the role was very much written with Robert Downey Jr. in mind, and you can definitely tell, that the quippy, snarky nature of his character, it's pretty much played for laughs for the most part. The comedic and quippy nature of RDJ's performance as Paul Avery is a welcome break from the more dramatic and darker aspects of Zodiac. Moving on to the final element of my review will be the direction of the movie. Because of the dark and twisted nature of Zodiac's story, it could have very easily in the wrong hands fallen into a glorification of the Zodiac Killer. But when you watch Zodiac for the first time, it's abundantly clear that David Fincher is not concerned with glamorizing or making the movie sort of a glorification of the Zodiac Killer in any shape or form. So a great example of this is in the opening scene of the movie. In this scene we see Darlene Farron picking up her boyfriend Mike Mageau at her house, and in these serial killer thrillers, what you'll tend to find is that directors often focus on the murders themselves rather than humanising the victims, and you can clearly tell right from the word go David Fincher's very much concerned with humanising the victims in a lot of ways. In this case, the various conversations that Darlene and Mike have with one another, it's pretty prominent prior to the murder, where a lot of other directors would have been very keen to get to the murder itself, and that's quite refreshing in the genre piece for sure. The final aspect of the direction that I love is how David Fincher builds up this sense of dread and tension in the viewer that doesn't always lead to an act of violence on screen. A great example of this is when we see the TV show host Jim Dunbar and Melvin Belli trying to contact the Zodiac Killer over the phone. If there are any filmmakers out there that are looking to create this sense of uneasiness and tension in the viewer without leading to an act of violence, this scene is a great example of that, and David Fincher achieves this through two simple techniques. The first technique that David Fincher uses is the use of audio, where he singles out the Zodiac Killer's voice over the phone, and in this moment he has our undivided attention. And because we hear just his voice, the Zodiac Killer, it just means we're able to understand his pain and suffering, and in this case we're able to understand the various headaches that he's been suffering, as he mentions over the phone. And because we're unable to see the Zodiac Killer, it just means that his threats that he, does over the phone, it becomes that much more frightening and that much more scarier for the audience, knowing that he could easily turn into the cold, callous person that we're all too familiar with from the beginning of the movie. The second technique that David Fincher uses is a visual one, where he uses quick cuts between various characters and showing their reactions to the Zodiac Killer and the various threats that he's giving out over the phone. The best example of this is when we see Robert Graysmith turn the TV off as his son's about to hear the Zodiac Killer lay out his plans of how he plans to blow up the tyres on a school bus. By David Fincher opting to show the reaction of various characters hearing the Zodiac Killer over the phone, it shows the audience how one person, one awful person, can affect people in more ways than one, and it just shows you David Fincher's absolute mastery behind the camera in terms of his ability to use just a couple of techniques, in this case audio and visuals, to convey the sinister and awful nature of the Zodiac Killer. So, just to wrap up this review in terms of my overall thoughts, so Zodiac is gripping, tense and engaging from start to finish. In my opinion, it's the definition of cinematic perfection. Couple this with some precise correction from David Fincher, fantastic performances across the board from Jake Gyllenhaal, Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. and a well-told and compelling story that's not afraid to take risks and leave the audience with more questions than answers. So overall, I'm going to give Zodiac a perfect 10 out of 10. This is the movie where you can tell everyone involved in the creation of this film was at their A-game. And as you can tell from my glowing praise of the movie, it's my favourite David Fincher film and one of my favourite thrillers of all time as well. So, I now hand it over to you guys. I'm interested to hear your thoughts in terms of whether or not you enjoyed Zodiac, and where do you think Zodiac ranks in terms of David Fincher's filmography, so interested to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. So if you enjoyed this review, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and be sure to hit the notification bell for updates on the latest videos. I'm also available on social media, so if you want to get updates on the latest movie blog articles and the latest videos, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so I'll post links to all of those in the YouTube description below. I hope you enjoyed my review of Zodiac, and as always, I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.